Radio.ie hosts the Irish History Show podcast because history matters. Radio turns 100 years young this year. Radio's history is powered by Radio Archives. For radio archiving solutions from people passionate about radio, visit radio.ie.
Hello and welcome to the Irish History Show. My name is Cathal Brennan, and as always I'm joined by my co-presenter John Dorney from theirishstory.com. Please check out our friends at radio.ie for all your radio archiving solutions. You can find this episode and all our previous episodes on our website irishhistoryshow.ie. You can follow us on Twitter at irishhistorypod or on Facebook, facebook.com/The Irish History Show. If you get a chance, please rate and review the show on iTunes, Spotify, Stitcher, or wherever you get your podcasts. It really does help us. And if you hear an episode you like, please share it on your social media. We are really grateful for all the support we receive from you, the listeners. Now, John has set up a Patreon for the Irish Story and the Irish History Show, and if you would consider supporting the show, there's a link in the show notes. And we really do appreciate everyone who's contributed so far. Thank you very much. Now, on this episode of the show, we are going to be discussing the most famous book written about Dublin, James Joyce's Ulysses. We're also going to be discussing a debate among Joyce scholars about the main character Leopold Bloom and whether he was based on a prominent Jewish politician and businessman, Albert Altman. We are joined by two very special guests. Vincent Altman O'Connor has a very personal connection to this episode's subject, as he is a descendant of Albert Altman and has written and lectured on the Joyce connection to Altman. Professor Neil Davison works in the School of Writing, Literature and Film at Oregon State University. Some of his previous books include James Joyce, Ulysses and the Construction of Jewish Identity, and An Irish Jewish Politician, Joyce's Dublin, and Ulysses, The Life and Times of Albert L. Altman. You're both very welcome to the show.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Now, first, I'd like to know, how did you first get connected?
Vincent, would you like to tell the story or shall I?
Oh, well, it's a long story. But I'll give you a bit of background. I was born in the 1950s and we shared a house with our maternal grandparents in Phibsborough. And we were a typical middle-class Roman Catholic family. What was slightly out of the ordinary was my grandfather's name, and he was Emmanuel Columbus Patrick Altman. And in the 1880s, the Altmans were one of Ireland's leading Jewish families. They were salt merchants, and the firm became known as Altman the Saltman. Now, I'll give you a little bit more background. My grandfather left the firm and became Dublin Corporation's health and sanitation inspector at the cattle market on the North Circular Road. And of course, readers of Ulysses will immediately spot the coincidence because the fictional Leopold Bloom is of Jewish descent, and he also worked at the cattle market. Anyway, my grandparents passed away, and the last of that generation was a lady we called Auntie Lily. And Lily had been in Common Amon and was a friend of Estella Solomon's. And she was also a friend of Eileen Sherrick, James Joyce's sister. And in the 1970s, Lily gave me a copy of Ulysses. And I found myself reading about the Invincibles, the Fenian James Stephens and Arthur Griffith, all of whom had been acquaintances of my great-grandfather Mendel and of his older brother Albert. And of course, readers of Ulysses will again spot more coincidences because Leopold Bloom is also associated in one way or another with these famous Irish nationalists. Now, one day I asked Lily about Moritz Altman, father of Mendel and Albert. And Lily said that Moritz died after taking poison. And I was absolutely stunned at this because Leopold Bloom's father also died after taking poison. So then, quite by accident, one day I met Declan Kybert and I told him my story. And he said I was definitely onto something. And David Norris advised me to submit an article to the James Joyce Quarterly. Like, I didn't really have the time So I wrote up a brief history of the Altmans and sent it to various Joyce scholars that I thought might be interested. But most were unimpressed, and they said that Joyce knew very little about the Irish Jewish community and that Leopold Bloom was an import from Trieste, where Joyce lived. The exception was Neil Davison, who was anxious to learn more about the Altmans. And I had read Neil's first book, James Joyce and the Construction of Jewish Identity, and I thought it was an excellent piece of work. So we started to correspond, and that's how I met Neil Davison.
In 2012, I got an email from someone I didn't know named Vincent Altman O'Connor saying, I've read your work and you got everything exactly right except for one thing. And then he proceeded to tell me about his great granduncle. And I was hesitant at first because since the publication of my first book in 96 and then paper 98, on occasion, I would get emails, mostly from Jewish readers of Ulysses, telling me that they read the book and then giving me some tale about they were certain about something and would I follow that in my research. The strangest one was the son of a father who had devoted his whole life to researching the Mongols and swore that they were a lost tribe of Israel, and that Joyce knew that and built it into a section of Ulysses. Anyway, the thing about Vincent's email was immediately followed with articles and things from his own personal archive. And once you open up that treasure trove of historical documents about Albert Altman, I don't think there's any turning back. And I think anyone who would contact who would be willing to go that far would start to be at least interested in this figure and his prominence in the press and in corporation culture and peoples during the 2 decades that Joyce lived in Ireland before he left for good. So it spun out from there, and I became more and more interested. Together, we eventually published an article with a third collaborator, Yvonne Altman O'Connor, who's the vice chairperson of the Irish Jewish Museum. And at some point, I said, I think I found the topic for my third book. And here we are today.
Now we're going to be going deep, as they say nowadays, guys, into Albert Altman O'Connor and Leopold Bloom. But first, Neil, if you would, could you give the listeners who are not so familiar an idea with why Joyce's Ulysses is such a significant novel?
Well, the book is, I think, one of the most innovative and important examples of literary modernism that runs along several different axes. It is one of the most innovative novels that's still a novel, still tells a story and has deep characterization ever written. Joyce's narrative experiments that become more and more interesting and always align with the form follows function, a basic modernist principle, telling, in a way, a search for a style, which was also part of modernism, making something new and discovering how you could narrate something. That led of his invention made it a spectacular example of modernism. And then Joyce, I think, is anyone who studies modernism would agree that Joyce is one of the greatest, not the greatest practitioners of the primary modernist technique of stream of consciousness. Joyce's stream of consciousness is probably one of the greatest representations of how the human mind flows and thinks between the past and the present, dreams, emotions, empirical reality in front of you. Joyce once said that if Dublin was blown off the face of the earth, someone could reconstruct it from my novel. Well, they could also reconstruct the complete life of this character, Leopold Bloom, and also Stephen Dedalus and Molly Bloom. I think Leopold Bloom is the most created character ever written. There's not one piece of his history or his mind, his unconscious, his sexuality, his emotional life, his interest in science and philosophy, his relations to others, his sense of himself as an Irishman, that you can't find out through the rhythm of his daily thought. So that's one end. The other end, of course, is that Ulysses is one of the great records of Ireland in its late colonial period. And the discussions about its politics and various forms of nationalism are not only specific to that incredibly pivotal moment of Irish history. But it becomes then a major work of post-colonial interest and decolonizing interest. And the ways in which Joyce sets up imperial impression and nationalist programs, and sometimes they're mirroring each other, sometimes they're pushing back against each other throughout the book, is just one of the most important sites to come from Europe in terms of understanding what imperialism did to people and what ways in which they were changed, sometimes contorted by it, and what ways they figured out to push back and finally free themselves from colonial oppression. So it's about Irish identity and Irish history, and it conducts its own kind of Irish historiography, questioning and in many ways examining and critiquing different kinds of Irish nationalism. And finally, in terms of what one of the things I became fascinated with it, which I still think is an important part of why it's such a significant novel, is of the era, it's probably the most important representation of how anti-Semitism and Jewish identity struggle and Jewish assimilation and what was happening to the Jewish position in Europe right on the eve of liberalism dying and the beginnings of what eventually became fascism. And that level is a level that broadens out beyond colonialism and imperialism, and it puts us in a place which is in some ways prescient towards what was going to happen in the decade that it was, during the decade it was first published and afterwards. So as a modernist novel, its aesthetics are just incomparable, I think. So many modernist novels are trying to do what Joyce does in ways that are just that much more innovative and that much more insightful. And as a novel, which, like many novels, is the other book of history to the historical period, I think it remains one of the most important novels of the 20th century. I will add that in 1934, when Bennett Cerf, who was the editor-in-chief of Random House, after the famous trial for Ulysses being obscene material, when the circuit court repealed it and reviewed it and it became legal, Bennett Cerf bought the rights to it, and thereby that was the first publication of Ulysses, legal publication of Ulysses in English language culture. And 70 years from then, his son, when asked in the 1990s to make a list of the 100 most important and influential novels of the 20th century, put Ulysses as number one and Portrait Artist as number three. So,
well, that's pretty good recommendation. Vincent, I might just ask you to talk about the Jewish community in Ireland, particularly the growth in the late 19th and early 20th century.
Ulysses is set in 1904, when Ireland's Jewish community was mostly of Lithuanian origin, and they came to Ireland after the assassination of Tsar Alexander II in 1881, and the assassination led to the promulgation of the discriminatory May laws, which in turn led to the migration of millions of Jews to the West, and including Ireland. And these Litvaks, as they were called, they were religiously Orthodox. They spoke Yiddish, and they worked in low-paid jobs, like they were peddlers, and some worked in the rag trade. And many of them lived in Little Jerusalem off Clonbrazil Street on the south side. Their cemetery was in Dolphin's Barn, and it was opened up in, 1898. So in 1904, there must have been about nearly 5,000 Jews in Ireland. Now, the thing about the fictional Leopold Bloom, if I might just move over there for a second, he was born in 1866, before the Litvaks arrived. And given that his father had married out of the Jewish faith, he would have had very little in common with the Jewish community of 1904. So Leopold Bloom is, for want of a better term, assimilated. No, it's not a word I like, but he's very much the cosmopolitan. And of course, he's a Christian. So over the years, Joyce's portrayal of Bloom has kind of puzzled scholars, and they have assumed, that Joyce took his inspiration from the cosmopolitan Jews he met on the continent, some of whom had been baptized. But, even today, many Joyce scholars are still unaware of the fact that there was a thriving Jewish community in Ireland prior to the arrival of the Litvaks. And they were among the most cosmopolitan in the English-speaking world. I suppose you could describe them as native Irish Jews, because they had been in Ireland since the late 1600s. And this community was associated with the Capel Street area, and their cemetery was at Ballybock on the north side, which was established, it was opened up all the way back 1745. So if Leopold Bloom was a real person, he would have been part of this cohort. And I should mention that the Altman family grave is in Ballybock Jewish Cemetery. Sticking with Ulysses for a minute, I got into a kind of an argument. I was at a James Joyce symposium in Antwerp many years ago, 2017 or 18, and this discussion came up about Leopold Bloom's origins. And quite a few people were totally unaware of the fact of this native Irish Jewish cohort. And I said to them, but many of these Irish Jews were among the most cosmopolitan in the English-speaking world, and they were known throughout the length and breadth almost of the world. And I'll give you a few examples. The Dublin Jew Thomas Bernardo, founder of the children's homes. Now, he was a suspect, would you believe, in the Jack the Ripper murders, and he is mentioned in Finnegan's Wake. And Cork's most famous Jew was the quack Dr. Samuel Solomons, inventor of the cordial balm of Gilead, which he claimed relieved sexual anxiety in young men. Now, I can assure you that was money spinner. And it's mentioned in Oxen of the Sun. And another one was Sophie Rafalovich, the wife of William O'Brien MP. O'Brien's novel, When We Were Boys, is on Leopold Bloom's bookshelf. But the most famous Irish Jew of the late Victorian period was Baron Albert Grant. He was an MP, a millionaire wine merchant, and a notorious fraudster. And Grant is the model for Augustus Melmotte in Anthony Trollope's novel, The Way We Live Now. Now, strange to say, but Grant died penniless in Bognor in England in 1899, a town visited by Joyce in 1923. So my point is, these native Irish Jews, the Jews who would have been contemporaries of Bloom, there were many of them, they were well known, and Joyce knew that there was an earlier native Irish Jewish cohort. And this is where we find Leopold Bloom.
Could I add to that there were Jews in Ireland, mostly in Dublin, in the 18th century, but that community really didn't get going until about the 1820s, the community that settled down in Capel Street. And it was German Jews and Polish Jews, many of whom came because someone first came and said, Ireland's a place where you can make a living and you won't be molested. It's that community, Capel Street, which the Altmans came to and had their first business in, and into which Leopold Bloom would have been born. In Ulysses, though, Leopold Bloom, even though he was born in 1866, anachronistically, Joyce makes him part of having grown up in the Little Jerusalem area in the south of the city. So it's unusual that the kinds of people that Bloom's mentions that he knew as a child growing up in that community would not be there in 1866 during his childhood.
We were discussing this before we started recording. How does the Jewish community in the United States and further afield, the wider Jewish diaspora, feel about Ulysses and feel about Leopold Bloom?
Well, It's an interesting question. You know, in the United States, Joyce and Ulysses in particular is over the last two generations, at least, maybe three, it has become only an academic read. The people who read Ulysses are students at universities and professors who work on Ulysses. But my generation and prior, I was born in 1960, so my generation, my father's generation, it was almost de rigueur to be a Jewish intellectual, to have read and be interested in Ulysses. And Ulysses as a site of, you know, the great irony and the stunning kind of learning that Joyce did about anything he took up, that was a place where issues of anti-Semitism, issues of Jewish identity struggle were so well and intricately represented by someone who wasn't a Jew. That was part of the fascination. Look at this book and look how so much of what we know of our history or what we know of our own struggles to be in a place that is, you know, has some of the, actually all of the issues of diaspora struggle, to be in nations and not thought exactly as the proper kind of national. So I think it became a major read while Ulysses was the kind of book that people were still, just the private intellectual, not the academic, still reading. And, work on Jewish issues in Ulysses begins very early on. In 1924, the French scholar who replaced Beckett at Trinity wrote the first article on why Bloom is such an important character to Jewish issues. And that went on apace, mostly from American scholars, all through the 50s and 60s. Joyce's biographer, Richard Altman, a very important American modernist scholar, was also from a Jewish background. So as far as folks today, we're looking at a generation that isn't particularly interested in modernism. My modernist classes do not fill. But I think the kind of student who comes to study literary modernism and the whole period of modernism, the first half of the 20th century, amongst those kids who are from a Jewish background, I think they still find their way to Ulysses and are still fascinated with it.
Now, Vincent, to dive into the meat of our talk today, we're going to be talking obviously about Albert Altman and his relationship with the fictional character Leopold Bloom. But first, who was Albert Altman? Could you give us a brief sketch of the man and who he was?
He was one of the Altman family who had come to Ireland in the early 1850s. And as Neil has in his book, they were part of the Capel Street community. That was the old native Irish Jews who had been there since the 1600s. They went immediately into that community. And they were salt merchants, as I said. I don't think he was in any way different from other Jews of the time. I know in our family, my grandfather thought that his uncle Albert was nothing short of a genius. And I mean, there seems to be a certain amount of truth in that when you look at his story. He was a kind of an autodidact. I'm not sure whether he went to third level college, but he had the traditional upbringing of someone who was going to be a merchant and work in the commercial area. So it's hard to know what actually changed and why he became a nationalist. I mean, he identified as an advanced nationalist all throughout his life, and he spent most of his adult life trying to get elected. I mean, he was almost 50 when he won a seat on Dublin Corporation, but he was also a supporter of the labour movement. He was to the left of, say, J.P. Nanetti, who founded the Dublin Trades Council.
Can you just briefly lay out what his nationalist career was in the early 20th century or late 19th century?
Well, as I said, he spent most of his adult life trying to get elected. He must have devoted hours and going around campaigning. And I would say one of the reasons he didn't get elected was that there was a great deal of anti-Semitic prejudice directed towards him. One of the things which distinguished him from almost all the other councillors was his fervent support of the temperance movement. And this put him at odds with Dublin's publicans, who had been in the past strong supporters of Parnell. But Altman was also a prominent member of Davison League. And I think there are traces of Henry George in his thinking. I think he was closest to Alderman Thomas Kelly, who became the first Sinn Féin member. There again, Altman shared platforms with E.W. Stewart, who was secretary of Connolly's Irish Socialist Republican Party. So I think you could describe Altman as both a municipal socialist and an advanced nationalist. I suspect that he was influenced by the Marxist Theodor Rothstein, with whom he may have been in contact, because Rothstein took the view that, utilities should be managed and controlled by the municipal authorities in the interest of the working class. And there are touches of utopianism and Fabianism in Altman's politics. I mean, he's not big on secularism, although I suppose being Jewish, he might be expected to advocate a free lay church in a free lay state, as Leopold Bloom puts it in his stump speech. But there's no doubt but that Altman was unique. I mean, one of his great battles was with Timothy Harrington, the thrice Lord Mayor of Dublin, who wrote James Joyce, the famous reference, which Joyce took with him to the continent. And it's a great story. I think maybe you should call in Neil on that. It's really well written in his book.
Yeah, well, I wanted to say that Altman did have secondary education at the Collegiate Nautical Mercantile School on 80 Abbey Street. And he was an excellent student, and then went into his father's business. And his father was originally not in the salt trade. He was a milliner and a tailor of military uniforms, actually. And it was Altman who expanded into coal and salt, and then saw sort of the rise and the management of one of the most prominent salt depots and salt refiners in Dublin during his era. Very well known. In fact, the area where he set up his depot and had his offices, Usher's Island, and up the hill from Usher's Island, was often called Altman the Saltmans. Around town, even once he got into corporation, I mean, he was a person who was associated with a business and an area of the city, so he was very well known. But during his political career, once he was elected in 1901, 1902, and then again 1902 and 1903. Unfortunately, he died in the middle of his second term. Once he was elected to the corporation, he was a very irascible reformer, very unpredictable, constantly wanted to focus on the reform of the corporation and what he saw as its corruptions and mismanagement, and was fascinated with trying to get the city to buy the tram system and other public utilities. He was a real character and constantly reported for about 5 or 6 years, constantly in the press when he was trying to become councilman and then when he did. And Harrington became one of his nemesis because Harrington was always decrying and shouting down his proposals. So it was a very interesting relationship because at one point, he became a spearhead of trying to stop Harrington from being elected to a second term, or a third term, excuse me, when there was a custom on the corporation to only have the Lord Mayor serve 1 year. And that's really when they became each other's nemesis. It's interesting that in Ulysses, in the Circe chapter, at the time Ulysses was written, Harrington was no longer in office. He had just left office, and Hutchinson was the Lord Mayor. But in Bloom's fantasies, when he imagines himself a Lord Mayor, he has Harrington as the Lord Mayor coming to him and blessing him and acting very contrite. So I've always seen that as Joyce building into the fact that at that point, Leopold Bloom has imagined himself as Lord Mayor on the corporation as being influenced by Albert Altman's reputation. It should have been, if that wasn't the case, it should have been Hutchinson that Leopold Bloom imagines, not Harrington.
Neil or Vincent, I don't know which one of you wants to take this up, but who was Mayor Harrington of Dublin, and why did Altman have such a difficult relationship with him?
Well, Harrington was a golden boy of the United Irish League. He was once Parnell's counsel. He was had connections to Cork and the Fenian connections to Cork. He was a mayor who was very interested in the petty bourgeois liberal sense of nationalism, connected to big business, connected to publicans, the kinds of issues that Altman, through his temperance labor sensibility, made central. And so Altman ended up being on the other side of nationalist arguments from Harrington. Harrington was an incredibly well-connected, well-liked figure, and so well-liked that he ran for a second term and got him wanted to run for a third term. And the left side, which was a minority of the corporation, was very much against it. They put up a guy named Dowd, who was a ex-plumber, owned his own plumbing company, as a labor candidate. Later on, though, Harrington was definitely spearheaded the campaign in the corporation, one of the most controversial campaigns ever at the turn of the century, to not agree to have an official welcome for the new king, Edward VII, when he came to Ireland for his maiden visit. And Albert Altman was on that side too. So they became strange bedfellows at that point. That moment, 1901, 1902, which was the height of Altman's influence on the corporation, it was such a volatile and important moment for Irish nationalism. There had been movements to not welcome the king's mother, Queen Victoria, when she came in the past, and it always split the corporation. But the corporation always voted to have the Lord Mayor and the corporation officially welcome her to Dublin. And this time they weren't going to do that. That is the occasion that Joyce witnessed. He certainly witnessed the vote that stopped the official welcome, and probably witnessed Albert Altman speaking on the subject, and did witness Harrington speaking on the subject. Huge monster public meetings were held at the town hall surrounding that. Maud Gudden came, all the big names came to have it out about not welcoming the new king. And Joyce took that moment and made it the center of the Dubliner story, Ivy Day in the Committee Room, which is about the post-Parnell confusion and malaise amongst the corporation about how they should proceed with nationalism. And in that story, I believe certainly, without a doubt, that there's an allusion to Albert Altman when one of the characters describes a well-heeled, cockeyed nobleman who's actually, seems to be a patriot, but is really a traitor, and suggests he's in the line of Major Sir. Major Sir arrested Lord Fitzgerald during the United Irishman Uprising in Watling Street, in back of the offices, stables, and at one time home of Albert Altman. Watling Street runs in back of Usher's Island. One of the most important ways Harrington figures in Altman's story and for Joyce is that he is the Lord Mayor at the turn of the century, and he was Lord Mayor at that moment, who completely backed, in a way he hadn't before as an MP and a member of the corporation, a no welcome to the new king.
And just to clarify, though, Vincent, what was the nature of Altman's and Harrington's disagreement? So, like, they're both Irish nationalists, they both sit in the corporation. Why couldn't they get along?
Well, I think ultimately it was a question of ideology. Altman was on the left. I mean, he took the view that Harrington was part of the nationalist establishment. Curiously enough, Albert Altman and Timothy Harrington were friends. Harrington wrote James Joyce, the famous reference, which Joyce took with him to the continent. And a few weeks later, he wrote my great Aunt Cissy a letter Harrington was thanking my Aunt Cissy for her support. So I remember this when I was young. There was two brothers. Obviously, there was Albert the Maverick, and there was Mendel, his younger brother, who was more of a populist. So Mendel cultivated the friendship of John Redmond and Timothy Harrington, whereas Albert was friendly with E.W. Stewart of Connolly's party and with other radicals on the left of the parliamentary party, and indeed outside it. Albert said one time, in trying to I suppose, define his politics and where he stood, he said he was a non-pledged member of Labour. So he was perpetually semi-detached from the Irish Parliamentary Party on Dublin City Council, even though, he was friendly with these people. Now, you wouldn't think it from the newspaper archives because they seem to spend all their time tearing strips off each other. But that's what's the fact of the case. And I think one of the most valuable pieces that we have in our archive is the letter from Harrington to my great auntie Sissy. Incidentally, all our archives now going to the National Library are taking great interest in it.
Altman had a reputation for being an upstart. During his campaigning for a better part of a decade, he had a reputation for being a kind of poser, an Irishman poser, an inauthentic Irishman, who was called various names: a Judas, a Jew, a German. On some level, that part of nationalism that had its own racism perceived him as racially not Irish, and someone's who was not should not have been sticking his nose into Irish politics. Interestingly enough, by the height of his company, he was a wealthy man. He always sided with labor. He was a very, fair employer to his laborers, paid them a good wage, set up a workmen's club dedicated to Parnell in his depot. And he then fell into, because of his wife's Cork's origin, interest in temperance. He had converted to Catholicism, although I don't think temperance to him was a sacred mission. I think temperance to him made a lot of sense through his left-leaning labor politics, because he saw temperance as a labor nationalist issue. And he was also someone who was constantly suggesting in chambers that the corporation was a very corrupt body. Nepotism and jobbery and payoffs and mismanagement of funds. And, he was a thorn in the side of the establishment, both from his left-leaning labor politics. Everyone called him a temperance nut. A lot of people on that side of national thought temperance was this religious fanaticism. Close the pubs, stop the working man from having his drink. And so from that level, he was in a different side of the nationalist causes than Harrington. And then the other level was, he was constantly telling the Lord Mayor that he sat at the top of a corporation that was corrupt, that allowed long pauses between when they had to pay their rates, or mismanaged public utilities. One of his pet peeves that Harrington always made fun of in corporation chambers was the city should buy the tram system, because this should be a public service. This kind of public-minded sense of left-leaning nationalism. To him, that was a no-brainer, and everyone thought that was crazy. Eventually, of course, the city by the 1920s or 30s did buy the tram system. So for all those reasons, and it is true that they were kind of tangentially friendly through Mendel. And I have them at Gaelic language meetings and other kinds of events. But as Vincent said, it was Mendel and his family that were truly friends with the Harringtons. I think that there was probably a professional courtesy outside of chambers between the two. But inside chambers, you can look at the newspaper articles again and again. They're at loggerheads during corporation meetings. So much so that Harrington often made Altman the brunt of jokes, suggesting how crazy he is, how out of order he was.
Well, Neil, we've discussed Harrington quite a bit there, but there's another figure in advanced nationalist Ireland at the time. Probably his reputation is most damaged by his views on Jewishness and the taint of anti-Semitism, and that's Arthur Griffith. Would there have been any connection between Arthur Griffith and Altman? And sometimes Griffith seems to have good relations with individual Jews in Dublin.
Yeah, Arthur Griffith is such an important, fascinating figure. And, his early paper, Sinn Féin and then United Irishmen, did have series of articles, not written by him, but he was the publisher, One was by a man named O'Donnell, the first series, and the second one was by Oliver St. John Gogarty, Joyce's friend, that drew on the kind of world conspiracy and financial conspiracy and the diaspora sense of Jews being kind of, of no nation and coming into nations and drawing the wealth out of the nation for themselves away from working people. They published a series of articles like that. But Griffith also might later on in his career also had a Jewish ghostwriter who's goes unidentified. Anthony Cronin swore that he had proof of that in his research. And Griffith also, by the time he was involved as running the country, he did say that in the New Republic, Jews would be welcome and full citizens too. So, he was catching the wave of a moment in the 1890s and the turn of the centuries, where these kinds of accusations against Jewish communities and countries were on the rise. He allowed that to be published. How much he believed it or not, who knows? But, as they say, it made good copy. And of course, his paper praised Father Craig during the Limerick riots in 1904, where the Jews were boycotted and some of them were driven out of their businesses in Limerick, inspired by a priest suggesting that the Jews were parasites and they were taking the money and the lives away and cheating real Irishmen. But here's the converse of that. In 1902, when Altman ran, Griffith himself, by his own pen, was talking about election and nationalist issues and praised Altman for being reelected to his seat on the corporation as a temperance labor nationalist, and said that there's only a handful of people who recognize that temperance is a nationalist issue. And they're the real heroes of the Nationalist Party at that moment, because it's the publicans and all the money that flows from production of whiskey and production of Guinness and staying open all the time and allowing working men to get drunk that are undermining the real nationalist efforts. And of course, Harrington and the more petty bourgeois traditional liberal side of the corporation, they were in bed with, they were for big business and for the publicans and for that. So, it's amazing that at that moment, Griffith must have known that Altman was Jewish, because if you just read the papers during the 1890s, you knew papers across the political spectrum, and certainly the Freemans and the Times, you knew that Albert Altman was this character who was the only member of the corporation from a Jewish background.
Yeah,
So
I mean,
that's
just
a fascinating moment that Griffith praised him.
yeah, just a brief comment on that before we move on. But I mean, I think the Griffith's anti-Semitic remarks are from a very particular time, which is the Boer War, where Jewish financiers partly blamed for the Boer War and the British invasion there of the Boer republics. But he's very close, for example, with Michael Neukleiter, who's a Jewish lawyer, who's aiding the Republican cause. I think, in my opinion, the Arthur Griffith's anti-Semitism is a bit overdone. But moving on, though, I want to get to the meat of our show today, guys. And why is it that there is a persuasive case that Leopold Bloom is in fact based on Albert Altman? Vincent or Neil, which one of you want to take that one first?
I'll start, Vincent, and you can take up. There is a level of biographical coincidence between the real life Altman and Leopold Bloom that is sort of uncanny and undeniable. It can't be tracked down to document or archive, except for the fact that it was these biographical coincidences made their way into the paper. And the first one is that Albert Altman lost his son, his firstborn child, and who was a son, at 8 days old. And Leopold Bloom has that issue of losing his son at 11 days old. And the other one is that Albert Altman's father accidentally poisoned himself and was a suicide. And Leopold Bloom's consciousness throughout the day of Ulysses is often wrapped around thinking about his father as a Jew who wandered around Europe, finally made it to Dublin and converted, went over by the way of the societies for the conversion Jews to the Protestant faith, and how he was a sad, remorseful older man who regretted his apostasy from Judaism. So just these, opening two biographical facts. We have a Jewish politician who was in the press constantly, probably the most newsworthy Dublin Jew from the mid 1880s through the moment he died in 1903, who John Joyce certainly knew and knew of. John Joyce was an incredible gadfly of the corporation, and that his death of his son was reported in the paper, and the death of his father was reported in the paper. So that's a beginning. You don't have any other model for Leopold Bloom who has those two biographical facts parallel with Leopold Bloom's biographical facts. But as those things, they on the outer edge, they could be coincidental. Child mortality rates were high, in Dublin, but so I think the real direction that I've argued and that I think is undeniable is Altman's political career, both in a macroscopic and microscopic way, parallel Bloom's politics again and again and again. And I think it's an absurdity, a logical absurdity, to suggest that James Joyce did not know about Leopold Bloom as an inveterate reader of papers and someone who followed the corporation. Don't forget, the corporation in Dublin was also the center of almost all the national controversies, right? The corporation just wasn't a town council. It was the center of, so many members of the corporation were MPs, and all national controversies about the country and the future of the nation often paralleled municipal issues too. And Albert Altman was at the center of so many of those that it would be impossible for anyone interested in the corporation from about 1886 to his death, the time Joyce would have started to read newspapers, not knowing about him. But, a left-leaning liberal, someone who, argued for much of his political career that public utilities should be, that utilities should be public owned, and Leopold Bloom constantly thinking, well, the city should run a tram line to get from the cattle markets, or the fact that Bloom is called the great reformer, the world's greatest reformer in Cersei, and Leopold Bloom ran as a reform candidate constantly. So, and you could tick off so many aspects of Bloom's overall sensibility and specifics. Bloom is fascinated with the Varney water system and the new water system, and that was also a pet project of Albert Altman's.
Vincent, do you want to add to that?
Well, I think the last thing that Joyce wanted to do was to reveal the identity of Leopold Bloom, because we might never have had Ulysses. Joyce's close friend J.F. Byrne stated in his memoir Silent Years that both he and Joyce knew the identity of Leopold, the real life identity of Leopold Bloom, but that Joyce was adamant that this identity be kept under wraps. And given all the difficulties that Joyce had with publication and fears of litigation, it seems to make sense that Joyce wouldn't mention who it was. A few years ago, the Joyce scholar Sean Latham, in his book, The Art of Scandal, he said that if Leopold Bloom had an historical antecedent, or if a connection could be drawn to a living person, then the grounds for a defamation suit would have been quite strong, particularly since the text delves so deeply into his sexual habits and private thoughts. But if you were a young police detective straight out of Temple Moor, I think you would have got the identity of Leopold Bloom without much trouble. And, I'm reminded of Jerry Johnston's famous comment. She wrote that fact and fiction are so intimately commingled in Ulysses that we find ourselves drawn to some discomforting questions. Now, if we stick with the fiction for a moment, in the Cyclops episode, as we all know, the Irish nationalist, the Citizen, abuses the Jew Leopold Bloom in Barney Kiernan's pub. Now, the Citizen has a tremendous capacity for drink, and he speaks poor Irish, and he is a supporter of Arthur Griffith's Sinn Féin, or so it would appear. However, one of the other drinkers refers to a rumour doing the rounds, which suggests that none other than Leopold Bloom himself is advising Arthur Griffith. Now, there we have a hint. The notion of an Irish Jew advising the then anti-Semite Arthur Griffith was considered preposterous. And I remember reading the reaction of one Joyce scholar, Bernard Benstock, and his was a typical reaction of the time. He said, "The reader is not to be expected to believe this delightful absurdity." However, with the advent of neo-Marxist and post-colonial theory, some Joyce scholars began to question this assumption. And in Joyce, Race and Empire by Vincent, he wrote, "Is all this linking of Bloom with Griffith a Joycean hint that there may be some truth to the story?" Neil mentioned there was one scholar, Hugh Kenner, thought that there was definitely some truth to the story, and he spoke with Anthony Cronin in the 1980s. And Cronin was convinced that Griffith had indeed a Jewish advisor. And you mentioned Michael Noyack. Well, it took until 2012 for Jean-Michel Rabaté in James Joyce on the Politics of Egoism to reveal that the Jew in question was Michael Noyack, who was associated with the Judeo-Irish Home Rule Association of 1909. But according to the Irish Bureau of Military History, Noyack was introduced to Griffith by Estella Solomons and James Starkey in 1909. But the question still remained as to the existence of a Jew who acted as Griffith's mentor in the years leading up to the founding of Sinn Féin. And it wasn't until the publication of Colm Kenny's book, The Enigma of Arthur Griffith, that Joyceans first learned of Altman's influence on Griffith's Sinn Féin. And that was in just recently, that was in 2020.
There is that textual base of that moment where, it's Bloom who gave Griffith the idea of Sinn Féin. Griffith was drawing on Deek's the Hungarian system, the dual monarchy. At that moment, too, in Cyclops, they hear that, Bloom is actually, they call him a perverted Jew. They mean not exactly a Jew from Hungary. So there's this little layer. Well, maybe if he's from Hungary, he's the guy who put Griffith in touch with the Hungarian system. But it's that does not negate what Vincent just explains. I mean, in 1902, when Joyce would have been back in the country reading newspapers, that is the moment when Altman's name appears in Griffith's paper.
I mean, I think that you guys, and I was introduced to this theory by Vincent about a month ago, but I think you make quite a compelling case, so Altman, like Bloom, is a Jewish Dubliner who's married to a Catholic. He's an Irish nationalist, and the family details, you mentioned the death of his father and so on, and of his child, very compelling details. But my question to you guys to kind of get towards the end is, how has this gone down in the Joycean community of scholars? Is this widely accepted, the idea that Albert Altman may be the basis for Leopold Bloom?
Not really. I mean, it's just getting going. I mean, I published my book in fall of 2022, and it's slow but sure to be reviewed. It was finally just reviewed earlier this year by Marilyn Reesbaum, who is a very prominent Jewish scholar, one of the most important ones in the James Joyce Quarterly. It was a very good review, but it was the first after 3 years, and I think there's a resistance in part because if you present an idea like this, which has so many parallels and comes from archival research, without presenting the fact that Albert Altman is mentioned at some point in James Joyce's letters, or somehow there's a code for Altman in Ulysses, which actually there is a moment in Ulysses which suggests an allusion to Altman's famous business calling card. But the lack of the smoking gun, I think, has put people off. I think that's short-sighted because when you have such a documentation of this figure being so prominent and so newsworthy, I think the two facts that you have to come to is that James Joyce knew who Albert Altman was and knew he was Jewish, or from a Jewish background, because Altman himself was converted to Catholicism and practiced Catholicism. But it takes a long time to push a theory that comes out of nowhere in some ways. And there's always been this constant reference to Alfred Hunter as the Jewish figure who Joyce based Leopold Bloom on, because he rescued Joyce the night that Joyce was beat up by a British soldier in Stephen's Green, and they walked home, and this is all just apocryphal, and they discussed life, and he saw him as a particularly compassionate, good Samaritan person, and that influenced Joyce's view of Jewish nature or Jewishness, worldly and kind and sweet, and but that's all just kind of apocryphal, because there is just a mention in a letter of Joyce being beaten that night. And there is a mention of Joyce wanting to write the final story for Dubliners called Mr. Hunter's Day, and then renaming it Ulysses. But that has been such a part of the accepted wisdom. If there's one Jew in Ireland who Joyce might have thought of as a model for Leopold Bloom, it had to be this guy Hunter. But now research has demonstrated that is very problematic. And the other thing is that it's quite clear that Joyce learned a lot about Judaism and got to know Jews and became intimate with Jewish friends in Trieste. Obviously, Italius Fava is the most important model, but there were others. And that a lot of the issues about Jewish identity and Jewish cultural identity and assimilation and crossover between Catholic and Jewish communities in Trieste, that obviously is the documented basis for Leopold Bloom.
Mhm.
But, I think that Altman presents a model that is completely tied in a microscopic way to the politics of the corporation, the politics of the city, and the politics of Irish nationalism in a way that no other model could be. So on some level, he's the only game out there in terms of a Dublin Jewish model.
And we're running out of time, but Vincent, if I can just get you in there as well. So, in terms of the Dublin Joyce scholars, how has your suggestion, your contention about Altman gone down?
Well, it's a kind of a mixed bag. I mean, quite a few years ago, Cormac O'Grada on the Come Here to Me blog said that Altman the Saltman opens up a whole new vista on Joyce scholarship, which is a big word. Now, I mean, I've been to quite a few Joyce summer schools and seminars, and first reaction to people when I explain about Altman is, well, there's quite frankly a lot of pushback. It just doesn't seem to fit their mindset. And so I guess it'll go on for a while, but gradually over the years, there seems to be an increasing amount of Joyce scholars who will take this on board. I mean, it's often been said to me, there's no mention in Joyce's letters or in his works about Albert Altman. Now, we know for a fact that a lot of Joyce's letters were censored. He censored his own work. And the great rival for Altman, if you like, is Italo Svevo in Trieste. Well, I think all you can do at this moment is take John McCourt's book on Italo Svevo and take Neil Davison's book on Albert Altman and see which of them ticks the most boxes. I don't think we can do anything more than that at the moment.
That's a great way to end, and a good recommendation for your book as well, Neil. So, guys, it's been a fascinating discussion, and thank you so much for joining us today.
So thank you very much to Vincent Altman O'Connor and Professor Neil Davison. You can find this episode and all previous episodes of the show on our website, irishhistoryshow.ie. You can follow us on Twitter at irishhistorypod or on Facebook, facebook.com/The Irish History Show. If you get a chance, please rate and review the show on iTunes or wherever you get your podcasts. So John has set up a Patreon for the show, and the link is in the show notes, and we really appreciate everyone who would consider contributing. So on behalf of myself, Cathal Brennan, and my co-host John Dorney, thank you very much for listening.
Radio.ie hosts the Irish History Show podcast because history matters. Radio turns 100 years young this year. Radio's history is powered by radio archives. For radio archiving solutions from people passionate about radio, visit radio.ie.